Welcome to Books and More, the channel where we explore timeless works that have shaped the human story. Today, we journey into the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, a monumental masterpiece of historical writing. With its sweeping narrative, sharp intellect, and profound reflections on power, virtue, and decay, Gibbon's work remains one of the greatest achievements in literature. Join us as we uncover the rise, the glory, and the eventual collapse of one of the world's most extraordinary civilizations. Chapter 16: Conduct toward the Christians from Nero to Constantine. When we observe the rise of Christianity in the Roman world, it is tempting to imagine that a religion founded on mildness, purity, and heartfelt devotion should have been welcomed by a tolerant empire. Rome had long prided itself on accommodating every superstition and every deity that her vast dominion contained. Her philosophers doubted, her common people acquiesced, and her magistrates sought only to preserve public order. Yet, the actual history of Christianity's early centuries reveals the opposite. The religion met suspicion, resentment, and, at times, fierce persecution. The paradox is explained not by the cruelty of the Romans, but by the profound incompatibility between the exclusive truth claims of Christianity and the civic religion that bound together the ancient world. The first dramatic clash came under Nero. His persecution of the Christians did not spring from a formal policy or a theological dispute. It was the desperate act of a prince whose atrocities had alienated his subjects and who sought scapegoats after the Great Fire of Rome. The Christians, already isolated by their refusal to join in Roman rites, were accused of dark practices and misanthropy. Though their numbers were still small, their secrecy and difference made them convenient victims. The tortures inflicted upon them were severe and theatrical, intended less to enforce a law than to appease the populace's anger. Yet, when Nero fell, the persecution ended as abruptly as it had begun. In the decades that followed, imperial policy moved in a wavering line rather than a straight course. There was no standing law against Christianity, but governors confronted the puzzling situation of having to judge people not for crimes, but for a name. Pliny the Younger's correspondence with Trajan reveals this uncertainty clearly. Unsure how to conduct examinations, Pliny asked whether mere profession of the faith constituted a punishable offense. Trajan's reply became the informal rule of the empire. Christians were not to be sought out, but if accused and obstinate, they were to be punished unless they renounced their faith by performing a sacrifice. The policy was neither merciful nor cruel. It was a cautious attempt to preserve public religion without provoking unnecessary violence. Despite such ambiguity, Christianity spread steadily. For long intervals, it enjoyed relative peace under emperors whose worldly temper inclined them to indifference: Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. Yet the peace was fragile. Whenever famine, plague, or social unrest disturbed the empire, the Christians became the preferred suspects. Their rejection of traditional ceremonies was interpreted as provocation against the gods. Rumors painted them as secretive conspirators hostile to the customs of mankind. Popular resentment, more than imperial edicts, often ignited the flames of persecution. A turning point arrived in the 3rd century under Decius. Seeking to restore the ancient virtues and bind the empire through shared worship, he decreed that all citizens must sacrifice to the gods. The edict struck at the very heart of Christian identity. Many believers endured exile or torture. Others faltered and performed the sacrifice, later provoking disputes within the church about repentance and forgiveness. But Decius's persecution, intense as it was, did not last long. His successors abandoned the experiment of enforced unity. The most systematic campaign against the Christians arose under Diocletian. Although personally inclined toward moderation, he governed an empire burdened by military threats and internal anxieties. Influenced by advisors who saw Christianity as a danger to civic order, particularly Galerius, he sanctioned a set of edicts that aimed to dismantle the Christian community. Churches were destroyed, scriptures seized, clergy imprisoned, and eventually all believers required to sacrifice. Yet this persecution varied widely across the empire. Constantius in the West applied the edicts lightly. In the East, where Galerius controlled policy, enforcement was brutal. Even so, the scale of martyrdom later celebrated by Christian writers probably exceeded the grim reality. The church suffered grievously, but it did not break. As Diocletian retired and the tetrarchy unraveled, enforcement grew inconsistent. Maximin in the East continued the harshest measures, issuing decrees that encouraged public hostility and attempted to revive pagan devotion. But the movement of history was turning against him. The Christian population had grown too numerous, too resilient, and too entwined with the social fabric to be uprooted. At this decisive moment, Constantine emerged. The son of Constantius, a ruler who had shown leniency toward Christians, Constantine inherited the western provinces and gradually rose above his rivals. His sympathies, diplomatic or sincere, aligned him with a community long persecuted yet morally unified. Without formally declaring Christianity the religion of the empire, he offered it peace, protection, and unprecedented honor. The brutal policies of earlier emperors faded into disuse, and by the time he secured sole authority, the last persecutions were already dying out. Looking back on the long conflict between church and empire, one realizes that the persecutions were neither constant nor universal. They were the product of circumstances, popular fears, political crises, the character of particular emperors, rather than a coherent program to destroy the faith. Many provinces saw little bloodshed. Long stretches of tranquility allowed Christianity to grow quietly, and in truth, its triumph owed as much to these periods of calm as to the endurance of its martyrs. The Roman state, vast and varied, lacked the unity and determination to quash a religion sustained by conviction, charity, and hope. The Christians' own conduct shaped their fate. Their steadfast refusal to participate in civic rights was interpreted as defiance, yet it also earned them admiration for their constancy. Their charitable institutions, their discipline, and their promise of salvation attracted converts across class lines. Persecution, far from extinguishing the movement, tested and refined it. By the time Constantine extended the hand of friendship to the church, the old order of paganism was already weakened, its spiritual authority spent. The emperors had tried alternately to enforce, reform, or ignore traditional worship, but none of these efforts restored its vitality. Christianity, with its universal appeal and moral seriousness, moved to fill the vacuum. Thus, the narrative of 3 centuries, from Nero's cruel spectacle to Constantine's benevolent favor, reveals not merely the sufferings of a religious minority, but the gradual transformation of the Roman world. The empire that once viewed the Christians with suspicion eventually found in their faith a new foundation for unity. And in this shift, history shows how ideas once persecuted as dangerous can become the guiding force of civilization. Chapter 17. The Foundation of Constantinople. When Constantine resolved to rebuild the Roman Empire after decades of civil war, he recognized that the old capital, venerable as it was, no longer suited the needs of an age transformed by new enemies, new religions, and new patterns of power. Rome had become a symbol rather than an instrument, glorious in tradition, yet remote from the frontiers where the empire's fate was truly decided. Its Senate clung to ancient privileges, its populace demanded perpetual spectacle, and its location, deep within the Italian peninsula, was poorly positioned to confront the rising threats along the Danube and the Euphrates. Constantine, who had spent his life along the frontiers and ascended the throne through the loyalty of the army rather than the acclaim of Rome, sensed instinctively that the future of imperial authority lay elsewhere. Thus arose the idea of a new capital, not merely as a residence, but as a deliberate creation, a city that would embody the unity and ambition of a rejuvenated empire. Among the many harbors and strongholds of the East, Byzantium stood out with compelling clarity. Its position commanded the narrow strait linking Europe and Asia, a gateway through which passed the trade of 2 continents and the armies of countless nations. Nature herself had made the site nearly impregnable. The deep inlet that later became the Golden Horn shielded its northern flank, the Sea of Marmara enclosed the south, and the Bosporus guarded the east with waters swift and treacherous. Only a narrow isthmus connected it to the mainland, and a single wall could transform the peninsula into an immense fortress. This strategic magnificence had long been recognized. Greek legend wrapped the region in stories of heroes and oracles. Ancient geographers praised its unrivaled harbor, and even earlier emperors had considered it as a potential capital. But it was Constantine who gave the vision form. Whether driven by calculation or by the subtle vanity of giving his name to a metropolis, he chose Byzantium as the seat of a new Rome, one that would not inherit the burdens of the old, but would project imperial power renewed. Once the decision was made, activity erupted with astonishing speed. The ruins of the old Greek city were cleared, foundations laid, avenues drawn, and walls extended across the landward side. Columns, statues, and marbles were transported from every corner of the empire to adorn the rising city. Temples were converted or rebuilt. Public baths, basilicas, granaries, and palaces rose almost overnight. It seemed as if the entire machinery of the Roman world had been redirected toward one point. Though later generations might embellish the story, there is no doubt that the first phase of construction was executed with a vigor that reflected both the urgency of Constantine's political mission and his desire to witness the completed work before death. The founding of Constantinople was not merely an architectural project. It was a calculated movement of population and privilege. The emperor understood that a city gains life only through its inhabitants, and he used every means of persuasion, honors, immunities, estates, to attract residents of distinction. Senators were encouraged and, at times, gently compelled to establish themselves in the new capital. Offices that once drew their authority from Rome were replicated, creating a senate, a praetorian prefecture, and municipal magistracies suited to the new metropolis. Artisans, shipbuilders, and merchants flowed in from Asia Minor and Thrace. To ensure sustenance, Constantine extended to Constantinople the Roman tradition of grain distribution, guaranteeing that its citizens would not lack bread. In this way, the city grew rapidly, blending old Greek foundations with the administrative framework of Rome. Yet it would be misleading to imagine that Constantine intended to diminish Rome's dignity. Outwardly, he honored the ancient capital and maintained its privileges. But the balance of real power had shifted irrevocably. The empire's energies and resources moved decisively toward the east, where richer provinces, livelier commerce, and more immediate dangers made the presence of the emperor necessary. Constantinople, unlike Rome, faced the barbarian world hand-on and could send armies swiftly to the Danube or the Euphrates. It was a city built not only for splendor but for vigilance. The ceremonial inauguration of the new capital displayed its dual nature, half Roman, half Christian, poised between tradition and innovation. The Hippodrome, the grand theater of imperial magnificence, hosted games and pageants. Musicians, priests, and soldiers marched in solemn procession, and Constantine himself, acknowledging both divine favor and human achievement, dedicated the city to God while imprinting it with his own authority. He declared it the new Rome, endowed it with institutions mirroring those of the old, and bestowed upon it privileges that ensured its rapid ascent to prominence. But beneath the pageantry lay profound consequences for the empire. By relocating the seat of government, Constantine inadvertently hastened the divergence between East and West. The western provinces, long accustomed to imperial presence, were now governed from afar. Rome, bereft of its practical role, descended gradually into ceremonial grandeur and political irrelevance. Meanwhile, the eastern provinces, culturally Greek and economically superior, became the heart of imperial life. Constantinople would grow into a city of immense wealth and influence, shaping the destiny of Europe and Asia for centuries. Gibbon observes that Constantine's reforms, though ambitious, were not entirely guided by foresight. The emperor was often driven by impulse, by the allure of glory, and by the desire to establish a legacy worthy of comparison with Romulus himself. Yet his choice of Byzantium was not a moment of caprice. It reflected a clear understanding of the geopolitical realities of the 4th century. The barbarian tribes of the north were pressing harder. Persia remained a formidable rival, and the Mediterranean world no longer possessed the unity that once made Rome the obvious center of all things. The empire had become a vast web of frontiers, and Byzantium sat at its most sensitive point. As the city took shape, Constantine's vision became part of its stone and marble. The imperial palace overlooked the sea. The great forum housed statues of pagan heroes, now joined by Christian symbols. Broad avenues extended toward massive gates. Churches rose beside public buildings. In its very fabric, Constantinople reflected the transition of an age, the coexistence of new faith with old custom, of Eastern refinement with Roman order. By the time Constantine died, the new capital was sufficiently established to endure the shocks of history. His successors expanded its walls, enriched its treasures, and fortified its defenses. Over centuries, it would resist sieges, accumulate learning, and serve as the center of a civilization distinct from the Latin West. Few of Constantine's acts shaped the world more profoundly. While military victories fade and political policies perish, the founding of Constantinople redirected the course of empire, set the stage for Byzantium's thousand-year survival, and altered the map of civilization. Thus, Chapter 17 is not merely the story of a city's construction. It is the story of a political instinct that grasped the shifting currents of history. Constantine's Rome on the Bosporus became the enduring monument of his reign, a creation whose significance outlasted the empire that built it. Chapter 18. Character of Constantine and his sons. The character of Constantine, viewed through the long and often troubled span of his reign, presents a mixture of virtues and faults so singular that history has preserved for him a place neither purely heroic nor entirely reproachful. He rose to power amid civil discord, steered the empire through religious transformation, and left behind a dynasty whose ambitions outlived his own wisdom. To understand the fate of the empire after his death, one must first understand the man himself, a ruler of remarkable talents, lofty intentions, and undeniable weaknesses, who looked upon the world with a bold confidence, yet yielded too often to the passions and flatteries that accompany absolute authority. In his youth, Constantine displayed all the qualities that win affection: courage, courtesy, physical vigor, and a gracious dignity that captivated soldiers and civilians alike. His ascent seemed marked by destiny. He inherited from his father a loyal army and from his circumstances an instinct for survival. Through a balanced mixture of prudence and audacity, he outmaneuvered rivals and emerged as the sole master of the Roman world. But the moral demands of power, which had ruined many princes before him, began gradually to mold his conduct. Where he had once relied on reason and magnanimity, he later displayed impulses that betrayed an erosion of judgment. His conversion to Christianity, perhaps the most consequential event of his life, reflected his complex nature. Constantine did not arrive at the Christian faith through a slow and contemplative process. It was the result of impressions, of political instinct, of a belief that divine favor attended his victories, and of a practical recognition that the energy of a rising religion could invigorate a tired empire. He accepted Christianity with sincerity, yet with an incomplete understanding of its doctrines. His mind, shaped more by ambition than by philosophy, lacked the patience for theological subtlety. Thus, he sometimes supported opposing factions at different times, permitting disputes he hoped to settle and creating new controversies in the act of resolving older ones. The emperor's virtues are genuine. He could be generous to the poor, protective of the oppressed, and sincerely devoted to what he believed was sacred truth. His patronage of the church was enthusiastic and, at times, excessive. Yet the same man who encouraged bishops and built churches also committed acts that cast long shadows over his moral character. Most tragic was the execution of his eldest son, Crispus, a prince distinguished for his abilities, and soon after the death of Fausta, the empress. The exact circumstances remain clouded by contradictory accounts, but all versions reveal an aging emperor overwhelmed by suspicion or swayed by intrigue, whose wrath extinguished lives that should have been most precious to him. Constantine sought consolation in religion, but the memory of these deeds followed him to the grave. In assessing the emperor's administrative talents, Gibbon acknowledges that Constantine furthered the reforms begun by Diocletian. He perfected the separation of civil and military powers, strengthened the bureaucracy, and shaped a more complex court ceremonial that veiled imperial authority in sacred majesty. These innovations preserved the empire, but also distanced the sovereign from his subjects and magnified the influence of favorites. The court became a stage where eunuchs and flatterers could dominate the counsels of a man who had once relied solely on his own strength and judgment. After Constantine's death, the empire passed to his three surviving sons, Constantinus, Constantius, and Constans, whose characters varied widely but shared a common defect. None possessed the balance of energy and prudence required to sustain the vast inheritance of their father. Their first act illustrated this imbalance with distressing clarity. Under the influence of fear and the encouragement of ambitious ministers, they permitted or ordered the massacre of their male relatives, uncles, cousins, and even distant kin, whom they suspected might claim the throne. This ruthless purge, committed in the name of security, shattered the moral authority of the young emperors and left deep scars on the fabric of imperial governance. Of the three brothers, Constantius, the future sole ruler, displayed the greatest capacity for endurance, but he was also the most suspicious and inflexible. His temperament was cold, reflective, and often overshadowed by religious zeal. Constantius embraced Arian Christianity with ardor, defending it not only as a theological position but as a matter of imperial policy. His actions plunged the church into turmoil. Bishops were exiled, synods multiplied, and dogmatic controversies that might have been settled through reason were instead inflamed by imperial intervention. He regarded himself as the guardian of orthodoxy, yet his shifting alliances and intolerance deepened divisions instead of healing them. Constantinus, the eldest brother, was of a more spirited nature, brave, impetuous, and sometimes reckless. Though he began his rule with promise, ambition drove him to conflict with Constans, resulting in his death during a failed invasion of Italy. Constans, the youngest, initially ruled with moderation, even earning the esteem of his subjects, but later succumbed to indulgence and favoritism. Dissatisfaction among the army led to his overthrow by a usurper, Magnentius, whose rebellion plunged the empire into another bitter civil war. Throughout these years, Constantius stood as the last surviving son of Constantine. Though capable of commanding respect, he lacked the broad vision that had allowed his father to navigate the empire's complexities. He governed through fear and ceremony, reliant on the counsel of courtiers who exploited his weaknesses. His military achievements were respectable yet indecisive. He fought the Persians to a standstill but never secured a lasting peace. His internal policies bore the mark of suspicion rather than strength. Perhaps the most remarkable figure to emerge in this troubled period was Julian, the young cousin whom Constantinus elevated to the rank of Caesar. Julian, destined to become known as the apostate, was at first a shy and scholarly youth shaped by tragedy and the trauma of seeing his family massacred. Yet, once given military command, he revealed unexpected vigor and brilliance. His victories in Gaul won the admiration of his troops, whose gratitude soon transformed into devotion. They proclaimed him Augustus, setting the stage for a confrontation between the two princes. Constantinus prepared for war, but fate intervened. He died suddenly, leaving Julian the uncontested ruler of the empire. Thus, the legacy of Constantine, split among sons who had neither the unity nor the virtue to uphold it, fell at last to a distant relative whose intellect and daring promised a new chapter for the Roman world. In the end, Chapter 18 presents the drama of a dynasty, a great founder whose light dazzled even as it cast long shadows, heirs who inherited the crown but not the genius, and an empire that, nourished by ambition and troubled by suspicion, moved steadily toward transformation. It is a reminder that the character of rulers shapes the destinies of nations, and that the splendor of a single reign can give way to uncertainty when its burdens fall upon lesser minds. Chapter 19: Constantius, sole emperor. After the turbulent years that followed the death of Constantine, the empire, long divided among his sons and shaken by rival claimants, gradually came under the singular rule of Constantius. His accession to sole power, however, was not the result of princely harmony or natural succession, but the end of a bitter series of civil wars, assassinations, and dynastic purges. Chapter 19 presents the reign of Constantius as a prolonged trial for the empire, a time marked by external danger, internal suspicion, religious discord, and the contradictions of an emperor whose abilities were real but whose weaknesses were equally undeniable. Constantius, more than his brothers, inherited the colder and more calculating aspects of his father's temperament. He was diligent, disciplined, and capable of sustained effort, yet lacked the decisive vigor and broad humanity that had distinguished Constantine. His mind, once it settled upon a course, could be obstinate to the point of cruelty. In an age when the empire required firmness combined with imagination, Constantius offered the virtues of vigilance and caution, but seldom the qualities of inspiration. The early years of his reign were overshadowed by the bloody consolidation of power. His brothers Constantinus and Constans fell, one in reckless ambition, the other in disgraceful debauchery, leaving the field open to Magnentius, a Western usurper whose rise threatened to tear the empire apart. Constantius abandoned the Persian frontier, marched west, and engaged in a protracted civil conflict. These campaigns, though ultimately successful, revealed both the emperor's persistence and his limitations. He relied heavily on methodical maneuvering, avoided decisive engagements, and sacrificed immense numbers of troops in battles that left the empire weakened even in victory. Magnentius, defeated and cornered, took his own life, leaving Constantius unchallenged ruler of the Roman world. Yet the triumph came at terrible cost, provinces depopulated, finances strained, and the Western legions exhausted. With political power secured, Constantius turned to the governing of the vast dominion he now possessed. The machinery of the imperial court, already elaborated under Diocletian and Constantine, grew ever more complex. Ceremonial forms multiplied, the emperor became increasingly remote, and the authority of eunuchs and chamberlains expanded in proportion to his mistrust of independent advisors. Constantius was not a tyrant by nature, but he was prone to suspicion, and once aroused, his fear expressed itself in harsh judgments against generals, nobles, and sometimes even allies. Trials for treason, often based on whispers, forged letters, or the ambiguous interpretations of astrologers, became a hallmark of his administration. The Persian frontier remained the central military challenge of his reign. Shapur, king of the revived Sassanid monarchy, pressed upon Mesopotamia with relentless ambition, determined to reclaim the territories his predecessors had lost. Constantius, though not an inspired field commander, proved a skillful defender. He reinforced fortresses, carefully rationed troops, and avoided disastrous pitched battles. Several engagements were indecisive, others inflicted grievous losses on both sides, yet Constantius, by caution and perseverance, managed to hold the frontier. The war, however, drained resources and prevented him from addressing other urgent matters within the empire. If military affairs demanded patience, the religious disputes of the age demanded clarity, yet Constantius provided only confusion. His commitment to Arian theology, or at least to a restrained variant of it, thrust him into constant conflict with bishops who defended the Nicene doctrine. Council after council was summoned, confessions of faith were rewritten, argued, and repealed, and the emperor, convinced that unity could be achieved by decree, repeatedly exiled prelates who resisted his commands. The most persistent of them, Athanasius of Alexandria, became the focal point of this struggle. His unwavering defiance of imperial authority made him at once a hero to his followers and a thorn in the emperor's side. Constantius, unable to comprehend such resistance, resorted to force when persuasion failed, deepening the division he hoped to eradicate. Amid this turbulence, the emperor recognized that he could not personally oversee every frontier. He elevated his cousin Julian to the rank of Caesar and entrusted him with Gaul, a region ravaged by Germanic tribes and desperate for strong leadership. Julian, whose youth had been spent in study rather than arms, surprised the world by revealing extraordinary military talent. He repelled the barbarians, restored discipline to the legions, and revived prosperity in the Gallic provinces. As his reputation grew, so did the uneasiness of Constantius. The loyalty of armies was fickle, and the emperor feared that Julian's popularity might undermine the stability he had struggled to secure. The tension reached a breaking point when Constantius demanded reinforcements from Julian's legions to continue the Persian War. The Gallic troops, weary of long campaigns and fiercely devoted to Julian, mutinied. They hailed Julian as Augustus, declaring him equal to the emperor. Julian protested, hesitated, and finally accepted the acclamation he could not prevent. The empire again seemed on the brink of civil war. Constantius prepared for the impending conflict with the same caution that had characterized his entire career. Yet destiny intervened. As he marched eastward, he fell ill. Realizing that death was imminent, he abandoned resistance and, whether out of prudence or resignation, acknowledged Julian as his lawful successor. Thus ended the reign of Constantius, without the spectacle of civil bloodshed that had marked the transitions of earlier years. He died leaving behind a record that invites both respect and criticism. Constantius preserved the empire through decades of danger, defended its frontiers against a formidable Persian adversary, and maintained unity where division seemed inevitable. Yet he was also a ruler whose suspicions alienated allies, whose religious policies sowed bitter discord, and whose rigid temperament prevented him from exercising the measured tolerance required in a changing world. His virtues were those of endurance and diligence. His faults sprang from fear and the corrosive influence of an elaborate court. Chapter 19 thus portrays Constantius as a prince who managed to hold together a world he could not transform, a custodian rather than a creator. His reign formed the narrow bridge between the age of Constantine and the brief, brilliant episode of Julian, whose character and aspirations stood in sharp contrast to the cautious, troubled emperor who died without an heir. The empire survived him, but it emerged weary, strained, and ready for the dramatic shift that the next reign would bring. The conversion of Constantine. Among the revolutions that altered the course of the Roman world, none proved more momentous than the conversion of Constantine. It was not simply the private awakening of a prince, but the turning of an empire toward a new order of faith, morality, and political imagination. Yet to attribute this shift solely to divine illumination would be to misjudge both the character of Constantine and the complexities of his age. His conversion, as Gibbon presents it, rose from a confluence of belief, policy, ambition, and necessity. It was neither entirely disinterested nor entirely insincere. Rather, it emerged from the temperament of a ruler who saw in Christianity both a source of spiritual reassurance and a powerful instrument for the governance of a fractured empire. The world into which Constantine was born had already begun to outgrow the religious framework that had sustained Rome for centuries. The ancient gods, once the guardians of civic unity, had retreated into superstition and ceremonial inertia. Philosophers mocked the myths they no longer believed. Magistrates performed rituals they no longer felt. And the populace, though affectionate toward tradition, followed the old rites from habit rather than conviction. Meanwhile, Christianity, though persecuted, gained strength from the very pressures placed upon it. It attracted the disillusioned, the disciplined, the hopeful. Its clear moral code, its promise of eternal life, and its insistence on divine justice offered what the worn institutions of paganism could no longer supply. Yet this rising religion provoked fear. Christians refused to honor the civic gods, refused to join in sacrifices, refused to recognize divine sanction in the imperial office. Such resistance appeared dangerous to a state that had long fused religion with public duty. Persecution was thus less a matter of ideological zeal than of political expediency. Emperors did not persecute Christians because they worshipped Christ, but because they refused to worship anyone else. When Constantine entered the stage of history, the empire was weary of tyranny, division, and unrest. Civil wars had become the normal path to power. Loyalty was fragmented, generals betrayed one another, and the tetrarchic system designed by Diocletian was already collapsing. In this climate of uncertainty, Christianity offered a moral clarity and organizational cohesion that the empire itself lacked. The Christian community, disciplined in suffering and united in doctrine, possessed a strength that could not easily be crushed. Constantine, who had both the instinct of a statesman and the ambition of a conqueror, recognized this. His faithful embrace of the Christian God, symbolized in the celebrated vision before the battle at the Milvian Bridge, cannot be understood solely as a mystical experience, though he likely believed in its authenticity. More importantly, it provided him with a banner under which to unite soldiers weary of civil strife and citizens hungry for stability. The sign of the cross, placed on the shields of his troops, became the emblem of a new political age, a sacred authority that could rival the old gods of Rome. After his victory over Maxentius, Constantine attributed his success to the God of the Christians. His gratitude quickly took legislative form. He granted Christians freedom of worship, restored their confiscated property, and protected their assemblies. Yet his transformation was gradual rather than immediate. He continued to employ certain pagan symbols on his coins, he tolerated the ceremonies of the ancient cults, and he hesitated to sever completely the religious traditions that still held emotional power for many of his subjects. His conversion, in truth, unfolded over years, not through sudden rapture, but through the steady realization that the Christian faith could offer unity where paganism had failed. Constantine's support for Christianity, however, brought with it unintended consequences. As soon as the church emerged from persecution, it found itself entangled in controversy. The Arian dispute, which questioned the nature of Christ's divinity, threatened the very unity Constantine sought. Though no theologian, he felt compelled to intervene. He convened the Council of Nicaea, hoping to end conflict through authoritative decision. The bishops debated fiercely. Formulas of belief were proposed, amended, and rejected, and the emperor, presiding as both patron and arbiter, urged them toward harmony. The resulting Nicene Creed established a standard of orthodoxy, but its victory was far from secure. Arianism persisted, and Constantine himself, influenced by advisors, later recalled exiled clergy and allowed the controversy to reignite. This vacillation reflected both his temperament and the pressures of politics. Constantine desired peace, not doctrinal precision. He sought unity, not dogmatic rigidity. His religious policies, therefore, often betrayed a lack of consistency. He supported one faction only to abandon it later, not out of malice, but because he never fully grasped the theological depth of the disputes he tried to settle. Still, his devotion grew with age. He funded the construction of basilicas, most notably in Rome, Jerusalem, and his new capital of Constantinople. He endowed bishops with legal privileges and entrusted them with arbitration in civil disputes. He legislated with increasing attention to moral reform. Gladiatorial contests dwindled, Sunday was set aside for rest, and practices inconsistent with Christian ethics were discouraged or abolished. Though these reforms were uneven and sometimes pragmatic, they indicated a sincere desire to align imperial governance with Christian morality. Yet Constantine remained a complex figure. His faith did not shield him from the darker impulses of absolute power. The execution of Crispus and Fausta, whether prompted by jealousy, intrigue, or misjudgment, revealed the perilous volatility of his nature. These acts haunted him, and perhaps hastened his turn toward religious consolation. It is not difficult to imagine that the man who had opened the gates of the empire to Christian influence also sought in private a refuge against memories that no court ceremony could silence. Toward the end of his life, Constantine postponed baptism until his final illness, a practice not uncommon in an age when baptism was understood to cleanse all prior sins. Whatever the mixture of motives, prudence, fear, or devotion, His decision symbolized his final submission to the faith he had gradually woven into the fabric of his empire. Constantine's conversion, in retrospect, transformed the ancient world more profoundly than any battle he fought. It set the Roman Empire on a path toward Christian civilization, reshaping its laws, its institutions, and its cultural identity. Pagan temples would linger for another generation, pagan sentiment for longer still. But the direction of history had changed. A new moral and spiritual order was rising, a world in which bishops would advise emperors, theology would shape politics, and the cross would replace the eagle as the symbol of imperial destiny. Thus, Chapter 20 in Gibbon's telling is not merely the story of an emperor's belief, but the story of how a personal choice altered the course of a civilization. Constantine, with all his virtues and faults, guided the empire toward a faith that outlived its political structure and gave the dying ancient world a new and enduring soul.